In the comments under my videos, I still often see Brexiteers claim that the EU is an evil dictatorship that forced its rules on the British until Brexit. So let's just have a look at the facts. Because no EU decision has been made in the years 1972 until 2020 without the consent of the British government. This is because the UK was a member of the EU during this time, and all EU decisions required the consent of all member states. The UK government had a veto over all EU decisions, which meant that it could block any decision that it did not agree with. And this veto power was one of the main benefits of being a member of the EU for the UK. However, the UK government did not always use its veto power. In some cases, the UK government chose to abstain from voting on EU decisions, which meant that it did not vote for or against the decision. And this was usually done when the UK government was not strongly opposed to the decision, but it did not want to be seen as supporting it either. The UK government also chose to use its veto power on a few occasions. For example, the UK government vetoed an EU decision to ban the sale of incandescent light bulbs in 2009. The UK government argued that the ban would be too costly for businesses and consumers. In 2020, the UK left the EU, and this means that the UK government no longer has a veto over EU decisions. However, the UK government is still trying to influence some decisions by negotiating with other member states, but more or less successfully. But generally speaking, the EU cannot legislate anything without the consent of the member states. The consent of the member states is required for most EU legislation, including legislation that is adopted under the ordinary legislative procedure, the special legislative procedure, and the consent procedure. That's how it is today. There are a few exceptions to this rule. For example, the EU can adopt legislation without the consent of the member states in certain areas, such as the common foreign and security policy, where the member states put a frame on, and the area of freedom, security and justice, because there is a frame set for it. However, even in these areas, the EU must respect the principle of subsidiarity, which means that it can only act if the objectives of the proposed legislation cannot be achieved by the member states at the national level. In the case of the consent procedure, the European Parliament can veto any legislation that is proposed by the European Commission, and this means that the consent of the European Parliament is also required for the EU to legislate in these areas. So, while there are a few exceptions, the EU generally cannot legislate anything without the consent of the member states. And this is because the EU is a union of sovereign states, even if some people don't want to believe it, and the member states retain the ultimate authority to decide on matters that affect them. The ordinary legislative procedure I mentioned earlier is the main decision-making procedure used by the European Union to adopt legislation. It's a complex procedure that involves the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Commission. The procedure starts with a legislative proposal from the Commission. The European Parliament and the Council then have two readings of this proposal. In the first reading, the European Parliament can amend the proposal, and the Council can adopt the proposal as amended by the European Parliament, reject the proposal, or propose amendments of its own. If the Council does not adopt the proposal or propose amendments, the procedure is referred to a conciliation committee, which is composed of representatives of the European Parliament and the Council. The conciliation committee tries to reach a compromise text that is acceptable to both institutions. If the conciliation committee reaches an agreement, the text is then adopted by the European Parliament and the Council. And if the conciliation committee does not reach an agreement, the procedure is abandoned. This procedure is a complex procedure, but it gives both the European Parliament and the Council a significant say in the adoption of EU legislation. And this ensures that the EU's legislation is democratically accountable and that the interests of both the EU citizens and its member states as a whole are taken into account. And I just want to give you some more details on this because it's important. So the Commission adopts a legislative proposal. The European Parliament and the Council have two readings of the proposal. If they cannot agree on a text in the second reading, then it goes to this conciliation committee. This conciliation committee tries to reach a compromise text. If the conciliation committee reaches an agreement, the text is then adopted by the European Parliament and the Council. And if the conciliation committee does not reach an agreement, the procedure is done. It's over. And this applies to a wide range of policy areas, including the environment, consumer protection, and transport. It is the main decision-making procedure used by the EU, and it has been used to adopt hundreds of pieces of legislation. The next one is the special legislative procedure, and that is a decision-making procedure used by the EU to adopt legislation in certain other policy areas. It's a less complex procedure than the ordinary legislative procedure, and it gives the European Parliament less power here. The special legislative procedure starts with a legislative proposal from the European Commission as well. The European Parliament then has one reading of the proposal in which it can approve, reject, or propose amendments. The Council then takes a decision on the proposal, and its decision is final. And the European Parliament cannot overturn the Council's decision. The special legislative procedure applies to a limited number of policy areas, and that's for a good reason. And that's the common commercial policy, the accession of new member states to the EU, the conclusion of international agreements, and the protection of EU financial interests. The special legislative procedure is, as I said, a less complex procedure than the ordinary legislative procedure because it does not involve a conciliation committee. And this means that the European Parliament has less opportunity to influence the final text of the legislation. However, the special legislative procedure does give the European Parliament a veto over legislation in these policy areas. And once again, I will in short repeat the steps here. So the Commission adopts a legislative proposal. The European Parliament has one reading of the proposal. Then the Council takes a decision on the proposal. If the European Parliament does not approve the Council's decision, the procedure is over, abandoned, because of the veto right. The special legislative procedure is less complex and less democratic than the ordinary legislative procedure. However, it's used in a limited number of policy areas where the Council has a strong interest, as I said, like the common commercial policy and the accession of new member states. But then we also have the consent procedure, and that's a special legislative procedure used by the European Union to adopt legislation in certain policy areas. It's also less complex, and it gives the European Parliament a veto over the legislation in these areas. And the consent procedure starts with a legislative proposal from the European Commission again, and then there's once again one reading where the European Parliament can approve, reject, or propose the amendments. And if they approve the proposal, it's then adopted by the Council. If they reject the proposal already, the procedure is abandoned. And the consent procedure also applies only to a limited number of policy areas, and that is on conclusions of international agreements in many cases. It also applies in some cases to the accession of new member states to the EU and the establishment of new EU agencies, and also on the adoption of rules on the protection of personal data. And as I said, the consent procedure is also a less complex procedure than the ordinary legislative procedure because it does not involve a conciliation committee. And this means that the European Parliament has less opportunity to influence the final text of the legislation, but also the consent procedure gives the EP a veto right over the legislation in these policy areas. And once again, I want to quickly go through the process. That means the Commission adopts a legislative proposal. the European Parliament has one reading of the proposal, and if the European Parliament approves the proposal, it is then adopted by the Council, hopefully. And if the European Parliament rejects the proposal, the procedure is done. It's over. And some people might say it's less democratic, but they still can stop it. So our elected members in the Parliament can stop it. But it's, as I said, used in a limited number of policy areas where the Parliament has a strong interest, such as the conclusion of international agreements and the accession of new member states. And there are some examples of legislation that have been adopted using the consent procedure. For example, the Treaty of Lisbon, which amended the EU's founding treaties, or the accession of Croatia to the EU, or the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. And the consent procedure is a useful tool for giving the EP a veto over legislation in certain policy areas. And some say it's less democratic, but it can lead to a deadlock if the European Council and the Parliament cannot agree on a text. But the European Union does not require a unanimous vote in all cases as well, so it's important to have different things there. There are a number of areas now where the EU can adopt legislation by a qualified majority vote, and this means that a decision can be adopted if it's supported by at least 55% of the member states, representing at least 65% of the EU's population. And there are some areas of policy where the EU can adopt legislation by qualified majority vote. And that's the internal market, that's agriculture and fisheries, that's transport, environment, consumer protection, and also the social policy, but also economic and monetary policy, and justice and home affairs. And the EU also uses qualified majority voting for some decisions on the common foreign and security policy, the so-called CFSP. But there are some areas of CFSP where a unanimous vote is still required, such as decisions on the use of military force. The use of qualified majority voting has increased in recent years, and this is because it allows the EU to adopt legislation more quickly and easily. However, it also led to some concerns about the democratic legitimacy of the EU's decision-making process, and I don't want to keep that hidden. And this is because a decision can be adopted even if opposed by a significant minority of member states. In order to address these concerns, the EU has introduced a number of safeguards. For example, the European Parliament has a veto over some decisions that are adopted by qualified majority voting. That's why I gave you the examples earlier. And this is where the consent procedure kicks in, I explained earlier. Additionally, the Council of the European Union must take into account the views of all member states, even if they are not in favor of a particular decision. And overall, the use of qualified majority voting has made the EU's decision-making process more efficient. But it has also raised some concerns about the democratic legitimacy of the EU, but there is still a parliament involved that is elected in free elections. In 2024, we will have the next elections there, and we must not forget that the members of the Council are the governments of the member states, and they are all elected in democratic elections. And so both of them are elected by the people. That is far more democratic than some other houses I could name here. And if you're interested in more Brexit topics or UK politics, the next video is here in the end screen, and I'll see you there. I'll be back.